The handsome man you see here wearing red stockings and a tremendously comfortable suit of armor with a sash to match the stockings is Hernán Cortés. He is undeniably the man that conquered the Aztecs and fundamentally altered the history of the American continent, perhaps almost as much as Columbus did. Obviously, Hernán Cortés's route and successes in the highlands of Mexico would not have happened without Columbus. This map shows you in white the distances that Hernán Cortés traveled across what is now Mexico, and how quickly he did it when you consider that he was doing it on foot or on horse. Within 7 years, Hernán Cortés and his men had pretty much covered the most inhabited and most important, for that matter, parts of what will become the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The green part that you see on this map was the area that was dominated by the Aztec Empire. And so if you look at the regions, the areas that Hernán Cortés and his men covered, you'll see that half of the area that he covered was controlled by the Aztecs. So that gives you a sense of why it was so important that Hernán Cortés conquer the Aztecs if he was going to effectively claim this territory for the crown of Spain. This is a map of the long and winding road that Hernán Cortés and his handful, well, not handful, but perhaps 200 to 300 men traveled on their way to what is now Mexico City, what was then Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Now, if you look at this long, slow march, part of it is determined by topography, right? It's not, there are mountains there that need to be either climbed over or walked around. But what Cortés is also doing is introducing himself to a series of people who will ultimately be essential in his conquest and his success at winning over, or at least just winning, the Aztecs. Tenochtitlan, here, built on a lake. This is a view, well, it's not a view, it's a drawing based on reports by people who saw Tenochtitlan as they arrived in 1519 over the Sierra that surrounds Mexico City. The reports went back to Europe, and Albrecht Dürer never saw this. He drew this based on the reports that this was a city built on a lake surrounded by mountains. And this is essentially what you see. You see the square city, the roads over the lake that lead to it, and the towns on the outskirts of the city and at the outskirts of those mountains that constitute part of the Aztec Empire. This is a more recent map of the valley, and perhaps also a more geographically accurate view of the map. And there you see again the city, the square in the center. So if you think about the town squares they're such a part of Latin America, if you travel to any city in Latin America, there's a town square. Well, these are not town squares that were brought necessarily. The concept of a town square is not something that the Europeans invented, because that town square existed in the city of Tenochtitlan well before the Europeans arrived. Now, what is the consequence of this encounter between these European men on horse and an empire dominated by Aztecs? The groundbreaking, earth-shattering consequences of Hernán Cortés's encounter with the Aztec Empire and ultimate victory over the Aztec Empire led to what one can generously call legends being told about this encounter, but what can also just be seen as outright lies about Spanish supremacy in the Americas, and misgivings about the far-reaching consequences of this victory. What you see in front of you are 5 of the most common misunderstandings or lies about this part in history. The first one is that the reason why the Aztecs were conquered by the Spaniards is because they mistook the Spaniards for gods. The images you see here are drawings of the god Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, rendered in human form. And the reason why this myth that the Aztecs mistook the Spaniards for God is so rampant is because there are documents that have been used as evidence of this that can tell the story of the Aztec people and leaders receiving an omen telling them to expect the human form of the god Quetzalcoatl, that this god will come down to earth and that they need to accept him. And this god will be of fair skin and he won't look like they do. He will be different from the Aztecs. Now, the only problem with the story, which you will see repeated on websites and even in textbooks, is that the evidence for this version of history does not exist in pre-Columbian or pre-conquest texts or images. This version of the story was written after the Spanish had conquered the Aztecs. Yes, it was written and it was drawn by indigenous friars and priests who'd been taught to write and who were part of a large-scale project to write the history of the Aztecs. But they were writing the history of the Aztecs for the Spaniards. So here we have one of the myths rendered irrelevant by the fact that the evidence that this story relies on, was written 50 years after the conquest. This is not a primary source that tells us what happened. It is a primary source that tells us the story that people wanted us to remember, a story that was completely constructed. The second myth is that before the conquest, indigenous